I want to be honest with you about something before I get into any of this. When I first built that ramp, I wasn't thinking about fights or lawyers or federal law. I was just thinking about getting inside my own house without asking someone to help me. That's it. That's the whole reason it existed. And I remember the afternoon it was finally finished, I sat at the bottom of it in my chair and just looked at it for a minute. 12 feet of treated lumber, a gentle slope, handrails on both sides. It wasn't beautiful, but it was mine, and it meant I didn't have to wait for anybody anymore. I didn't know then that a piece of wood and a $43 HOA fine notice would turn into one of the most exhausting, clarifying experiences of my entire life. The letter came on a Tuesday. I know it was Tuesday because my home health aide comes on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and she was the one who picked it up from the mailbox and brought it inside with a face that told me something was off before she even handed it to me. The envelope had that formal return address in the corner, the kind that's printed too neatly, and inside was a single page on HOA letterhead informing me that my front entry wheelchair ramp was in violation of the community's architectural standards, specifically something they called the Uniform Exterior Appearance Covenant, and that I had 30 days to remove it or face fines beginning at $43 per day until I complied. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time because I thought I had misunderstood something. I hadn't. Now, I need to give you a little context here because the ramp didn't appear overnight. I had submitted an architectural modification request 4 months before construction. I filled out their form, I attached the contractor's drawing, I wrote a cover letter explaining that I had a progressive neuromuscular condition and that the 2 front steps into my home had become impossible for me to navigate safely on my own. I sent it certified mail. I kept the receipt. The HOA board had 60 days under their own bylaws to respond, and after 60 days, I heard absolutely nothing. So I called, left a voicemail, called again a week later, sent an email. Nothing. After 90 days of silence, I consulted with the contractor, who told me that in most cases, no response within the review period constituted implied approval, and we moved forward. The ramp went up in November. The violation notice arrived the following March. 4 months. They watched me use that ramp every single day for 4 months before they said anything. What made it stranger was that I knew some of the board members. Not well, but the way you know neighbors, by sight, by a wave, by occasional small talk near the mailboxes. One of them, a man I'll call Gerald, had even commented on the ramp when it was first going in. He'd been walking his dog past the house and he stopped and said, and I remember this clearly, he said it looked like solid work. He seemed genuinely friendly. So when I saw his name listed as a signatory on the violation letter, I had this strange moment of thinking it must be a different Gerald. It wasn't. I called the HOA management company the next morning. The woman I spoke to was polite in that professional way that means nothing, the kind of polite that's just a layer of insulation between you and the actual answer. She told me the board had received a complaint from a neighbor about the ramp's appearance, that the complaint had triggered a formal review, and that the board's position was that I had not received written approval prior to construction, and therefore the structure was unauthorized. I asked her about the 90 days of silence. She said she couldn't speak to what had or hadn't been communicated previously. I asked her who filed the complaint. She said that was confidential. I spent that evening doing something I probably should have done before I ever built the ramp. I started reading, not just the HOA documents I had, but the Fair Housing Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, HUD guidance documents. I'm not a lawyer, I don't have any legal background, but I can read. And what I read that night made something shift inside me, quietly, like a door unlocking. Because here's what those documents say, and I want to be precise about this because precision matters. Under the Fair Housing Act, a homeowner with a disability has the right to make reasonable modifications to their home to afford them full enjoyment of the premises. The HOA cannot deny that right. They can require you to submit a request, they can ask for reasonable conditions, but they cannot simply say no. And when they go silent for 90 days and then send a violation notice 4 months later demanding you tear down the only thing that lets you independently access your own front door, that starts to look less like an architectural dispute and more like something else entirely. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning I called a disability rights attorney. I wasn't sure I could afford one, and I told her that up front. She told me to tell her the facts first and we'd worry about cost afterward. I told her everything. The modification request, the 90 days of silence, the ramp, the March letter, the board member who had seen the ramp go up and said nothing for 4 months. She was quiet for a moment after I finished, and then she said something that I've thought about many times since. She said, "They may not understand what they've done yet, but they will." She agreed to take the case on a contingency-adjacent basis, meaning her fee would come largely from any settlement or damages. She said cases involving disability accommodation denials by HOAs had specific federal teeth, and that HOAs, in her experience, often didn't realize they were operating in federally regulated territory until someone pointed it out to them in writing. She pointed it out to them in writing about 2 weeks later. The letter she sent was not long. It was 3 pages, but every paragraph cited a federal statute or a HUD regulation or a case precedent, and it made clear that the HOA's demand that I remove my wheelchair ramp potentially constituted a violation of the Fair Housing Act, that their failure to respond to my modification request within a reasonable time frame did not extinguish my rights under federal law, and that if the board did not withdraw the violation notice and formally approve the modification within 14 days, we would be filing a complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development and exploring all available legal remedies, including claims for compensatory and punitive damages. I did not attend whatever meeting the board had after they received that letter. I wasn't there, but I heard later, secondhand through a neighbor I trusted, that the room got very quiet when the management company's representative read the part about punitive damages. Here's where I have to tell you something that complicated everything, because stories like this are always more complicated than they look from the outside. About a week after my attorney sent that letter, I ran into Gerald. Not by accident, I think. He seemed to be waiting near the end of my driveway, and when I came out, he walked over and stood there for a moment, looking uncomfortable in a way that I recognized. The look of someone who has realized they've done something wrong, but hasn't fully decided what to do about it yet. He told me he hadn't known about my medical situation. He said the complaint hadn't come from him, that he'd voted against sending the violation notice, that he'd been outvoted by 2 other board members who felt strongly about maintaining consistent enforcement. He said he was sorry. He looked like he meant it. And the thing is, I believed him, which made me feel something I hadn't expected to feel in the middle of all this, which was sadness, not anger. Sadness that the system had put him in a position where his decency got outvoted by someone else's rigidity, and sadness that it had taken a federal cease and desist letter for any of this to get sorted out. I thanked him for telling me. I didn't know what else to say. The board withdrew the violation notice on day 13, officially, in writing, with a formal letter acknowledging my modification request had been received and was hereby approved, and that no fines had accrued and none would. My attorney reviewed the letter and said it was legally sufficient. She also told me we still had the option to file a HUD complaint for the distress and legal costs already incurred, and that the decision was entirely mine. I thought about it for several days. I kept coming back to Gerald standing at the end of my driveway, looking like a man who had just realized how the world looked from where I was sitting. I kept thinking about the neighbor who had filed the complaint, whose name I still didn't know, who had looked at a wheelchair ramp and seen an eyesore instead of someone's independence. And I kept thinking about the $43 per day that the HOA expected me to simply absorb, presumably until I gave up or found somewhere else to live. I filed the HUD complaint. Not for money, I want to be clear about that. The complaint triggered a federal investigation and a mandatory mediation process. As part of the resolution, the HOA was required to update its modification request policy into a clear written response requirement within 60 days, provide documentation to all residents about their rights under the Fair Housing Act, and pay a small settlement that covered my attorney fees and a portion of the distress damages. They also had to put the policy change in the community newsletter. I never found out who filed the original complaint against me. Maybe I'll always wonder a little, but the thing I think about most now isn't the legal outcome or the letters or the fines that never happened, What I think about is that afternoon when the ramp was first finished and I sat at the bottom of it and felt something close to ordinary. Just a person, a house, and a way inside that didn't require asking for help. That feeling was worth fighting for. And I'm glad I understood, even before the lawyers got involved, that some fights find you whether you go looking for them or not. The ramp is still there. It's not going anywhere.